one thing I will say is that I feel like there's a really big difference from social media, just putting out social media content, and actual left-wing organizing. Because in actual left-wing organizing, you have to associate with people who disagree with.
Exactly.
Whereas on social media, if you fight with people, it's like it gets you more attention. Right.
Yes.
So there's an incentive on social media to clash with people, to call out people, to condemn them. Whereas in real actual organizing, it's the opposite. You want to build unity to actually get something done. And I think that is underlying a lot of this as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I would say you particularly got a harsh end of that recently. Well, not recently, but in recent months. And as somebody who has done a lot of the real life organizing, who has actually spent time not only organizing, but also doing reporting on, state activity, et cetera, do you want to talk about that at all? Do you want to address the thing?
I don't know. I mean, first of all, it's interesting to me. ContraPoints, probably one of the most famous trans YouTube channel. I mean, very good politics. She has been canceled as a transphobe, right? I'm somebody who here in New York City, we protested against the NYPD for their policy of profiling trans people, which they did, and they still, profiling trans people in their sex worker, crackdown and, arresting trans people and profiling them as potential sex workers. I went to the Trans Day of Action.
Physical, actual, showing up and doing real work. I mean, protesting the police, that's not a non-risky thing to do. It's not entirely safe to protest the police, And it sounds like you were actually, doing the work as far as like actually organizing and advancing an agenda which helps trans people. Right.
But yet, none of that matters. Right. The fact that I interviewed somebody who had, a position on the transgender issue and then I didn't argue with them or something like that is being used against me. And honestly, I don't really know enough about it. And I almost don't want to know about it, because at the end of the day, right, I would not stop supporting someone's human rights. I would not advocate hate crimes or discrimination against somebody because of some ideological question, right? I don't know the science behind it. I know that there's a lot of debates about it, and I don't care. I'm for an end to discrimination against trans people. I'm for full rights to trans people. I'm for equality. I'm for everything. I mean, I don't understand why does this result in condemnation? But even me addressing this issue right now, I can guarantee you this is a lighting up. There are people that are just filled with rage the way I'm talking about this right now. And it's like, I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do to satisfy you. The sex worker issue is very similar.
When you basically say trans rights and they're like, no, you didn't say it right.
Yeah.
The fact that they got upset with you for interviewing someone with a different perspective and you weren't like doing the Twitch debate me bro shit, that's what they always want. Like they want it to be like a blood sport when they see a leftist discussing an issue with someone. They had the same issue with Zizek when he was talking to Peterson, because they wanted Zizek to turn it into some kind of like screaming match, some kind of like insult thing, but because they were both civil with each other and they were discussing ideas rather than launching personal attacks, that was seen as a big problem. And it's just an overall issue that leftists need to overcome, like this idea that every interaction with someone who is not aligned with you has to be hostile.
Exactly. There's also I think I have an understanding of what those people, because when I back in my Radlib days, back in 2016, when I was just a wee little Radlib, I was very sort of on the sort of black kind of identitarian train at that point in my life, and there's this whole kind of, and when you absorb that worldview, which I think is somewhat it's prevalent within that specific constituency, it's like, if you don't understand me and if you don't immediately sort of capitulate to my view of how I should be treated and viewed and understood, if you're not making the effort to understand every way that you could possibly harm me, right, whether it be advertently or inadvertently, then you are an enemy. And that's sort of the line of thinking that kind of floats around within those identitarian circles is that you should know, and if you don't know, you should be like spending time poring over. Like I remember, because it was like very early in me and Jake's like relationship, I would be like, okay, so you need to read this, and you need to read this, and you need to read this, and he's like, I don't need to read this not to hate you. Like I fuck you, I put my penis in you pretty regularly. Sorry, but in my mind,
conversation wasn't quite.
It just took a turn.
One thing I've noticed is there's kind of a lack of
Just
nuance.
doesn't miss a beat. Caleb, the real pro here.
But there's kind of a lack of nuance, right? Where it's some of the attacks on me perplex me because it's like he said this thing, and this thing he said sounds kind of like something completely different that is said by somebody on the right.
Yeah.
And doesn't it kind of remind you of maybe the same thing there? Yeah. So therefore, he is on the right secretly. And it's like you hear that, and it's like, what? Yeah. For example, George Soros is a real person, right? The Open Society Institute is real. George Soros is a real person. But he's not a communist.
No,
right? He is not a communist.
He's
this
a billionaire.
Person who toppled the Eastern Bloc.
Owning class.
This is a person who is vehemently anti-communist. And the right wing is going around telling people, oh, there's this evil communist George Soros who's behind every left-wing cause. And if the response of the left, basically, according to these people, all you're allowed to say in response to that right-wing thing about George Soros is you're supposed to say, that is not true. You are an anti-Semite.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, no, George Soros is a real person. But he's an anti-communist, number one, right? And number two, real left-wing politics is very different than what George Soros promotes and believes, right? But we can't have that conversation. We can't have a nuanced conversation. It's either George Soros doesn't exist, and if you acknowledge him, you're anti-Semitic. And if you say anything other than that, if you acknowledge the role that he played and the CIA and what they did in the Eastern Bloc and Jeffrey Sachs and all the stuff, there's a really important conversation that needs to be had there.
Yeah.
But it reminds me, I grew up around a lot of evangelical fundamentalists, and people talk about thought stopping in a cult, right? You talk about evolution, right? They'd say, I believe the Bible, it's 100% true. You say to them, what about the fossil record? Oh, I believe the Bible, it's 100% true. Well, this is what these people are doing, right? You say, George Soros is a real people. You're an anti-Semite, it's not true. And it's just like, it's a way of stopping people from thinking, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
That we need to be able to talk about these things, right? And that there are there are things right-wingers say that, they always say the best lie has a grain of truth in it, right? I mean, and they will take true things and distort them.
Yes.
And if leftists are not able to then talk about the actual nature of what's going on, a great example, years ago, Alex Jones, the right wing, we were pushing this FEMA camps idea, right? That Obama was building these camps and he was going to round up all the right wingers and put them in prison camps. This was during the Obama years. And he cited this law called the McCarran Internal Security Act of 1951, which was a law that was passed during the McCarthy period that gave the U.S. Department of Justice permission to assemble a list of communists and dissidents, leftists, who would be rounded up and put in prison camps if the Soviet Union invaded the United States or something like that. Well, the law is been overturned by the courts. It's no longer good law. But Alex Jones and the far right-wing Tea Party were going around saying, that this law existed and all that. So I get an email, one of the mass emails of the Southern Poverty Law Center, and they're going over top right-wing lies, right? Lie number one, FEMA camps. No such camps have ever existed. No such law has ever been passed. No, there very clearly was a law that was passed. It was just to be used against communists, number one. And number two, it was overturned by the courts. But when you say that law doesn't exist, all somebody on the right has to do is look up that law, and they say, you lied, and the right wins. And but Southern Poverty Law Center is too afraid to have a conversation about McCarthyism? Like, I don't get this.
Absolutely.
It's a partisan brainworm that I see all the time where, there was even stuff where, drugs that actually do work to slow the progress of COVID, simply because Trump mentioned them, doctors would have to say to patients, like, is this something that you're interested in? Or there are patients who just flat out refuse to take the drugs because Trump mentioned them, or anything that is the right wing is right about, because they're not wrong about everything. Like you said, there's a grain of truth in every falsehood. It doesn't matter. We obfuscate that territory and inevitably surrender it to them, which gives them more power. One of the really interesting things that you talked about was this idea of, a kind of covert transformation of the meaning of socialism and the mechanisms that sort of work behind transforming what socialism is actually supposed to be and the mode that we have today.